Arizona desert, Gideon spots a figure by the dry stream. The sun bore down on the Arizona territory like it had a vendetta against the land. Heat shimmered across the cracked earth, turning every breath into a labor and every step into a test. Gideon Ashford tugged Buck his gelding to a halt near what had once been a stream, now no more than a ghostly ribbon of pale stone weaving through sagebrush and thorn. His canteen sloshed near empty. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and the tear in his right boot had gathered a fine layer of desert grit that bit at his heel with every stirrup shift. Still something tugged at his senses. Not a sound, but a stillness, unnatural, unsettling. He narrowed his eyes against the glare and scanned the arroyo. Then he saw it, a figure crouched low by the dry stream bed. At first he thought it was just another boulder, sun-bleached and still, but it didn't sit quite right with the rest of the landscape. It was too soft, too human in shape. He didn't move at first, just watched. The desert played tricks and he'd been fooled before. But this didn't waver like a mirage. It held its form. No wind stirred it. No life flickered. That stillness made something in Gideon tighten. Real or not, he had to see. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, dust streaking sweat, and dismounted. The air was so dry it rasped against his throat as he took a careful step forward, boots crunching over brittle scrub. His instincts didn't raise alarm, no ambush, no threat, but they pulsed with something else. Urgency. The kind of pull that made a man go forward even when the sun was high and the trail uncertain. As he neared, the truth became clear this wasn't some illusion. It was a woman, and she was barely holding on. A woman on her knees. Seleni, in silence. She was young, maybe mid-20s, though hardship had already carved its name into her frame. Her dress clung to her like a second skin layered in dirt and sun-dried sweat. The hem was shredded, tangled with cactus spines and torn brush. Her hands lay limp in her lap, fingers slack as though the act of clenching had long since burned away. Her skin was dust-dry, lips cracked and flaking. Her dark brown hair had lost its shine, now twisted in knots against her neck. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were open but empty. Not blind, but not present either. Like her soul had slipped a few inches outside her body and didn't know how to find its way back. Gideon crouched, slowly, careful not to startle her, though she didn't flinch. He uncapped his canteen and held it out. "Mom," he said, voice low and steady. "Here. Drink." Her eyes flicked, barely moving, then again. A blink, slow and foggy. She saw him, but it was like looking through a window caked in dust. When he brought the water to her lips, she recoiled at first, but not far. A moment later, she let him touch the canteen to her mouth. The water was warm, barely more than a trickle, but she drank it like it was gold. She coughed after a few swallows, body jolting weakly, but still reached for more. He let her have it. And in that moment, something passed between them, not a word, not a promise, but a tether light as breath. Names and lost brothers. A voice from the edge. After another careful sip, she exhaled like it was the first full breath she'd taken in days. Her voice came thin, more air than sound, but it formed words. "Thank you." Gideon nodded. "I'm Gideon Ashford," he said. "You got a name?" She blinked slowly, as if pulling herself back into her body. Then so soft he almost didn't hear it. She whispered, "Seleni. Seleni Loel." He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. A name meant she hadn't completely given up. "All right, Seleni," he said gently. You alone out here?" Her gaze dropped to her hands, fingers twitching faintly. "My wagon broke. 2 days ago," she murmured. "My brother rode off to find help. Never came back." Gideon felt the weight of that sentence settle in the dust between them, "And you started walking." She nodded. "I thought maybe I'd find water. You found a dry stream," he said, not unkindly. "I figured that out." Something in her tone, dry, almost sardonic, startled a strange ache in his chest. Even in her suffering, she held some thread of herself. He stood and extended a hand. "Well, you found me too. I've got a small camp not far off. My horse can carry us both." She didn't answer at first. Her eyes drifted again toward the lifeless ribbon of rock behind her, like she was saying goodbye to something. Then she looked back at him and gave a single solemn nod. When he helped her to her feet, she was lighter than she should have been, like hunger had already started carving away what the desert hadn't claimed. When she stumbled, he caught her. She stiffened for a moment, then leaned slightly into him. "I'm not going to let you fall," he said. And this time, she didn't argue. A dry stream and a quiet rescue, from dust to shade. The ride back to Gideon's camp was slow and silent, the kind of silence not made of awkwardness but of preservation, each conserving breath, strength, and thought. He adjusted his grip to keep her steady in the saddle, her frame small and sharp against him, like she'd already become more bone than weight. The heat hadn't let up, and the landscape rolled around them in cracked earth and whispering sage. Time felt like it stretched thin, held together by dust and stubbornness. They didn't speak again until the boulders came into view, 2 weather-worn rocks leaning together like old men mid-conversation. Between them, stretched low and taut, was a piece of canvas tied to stakes, hammered into the ground. No walls, no comforts, just a bedroll, a fire pit made of stones and the smallest shade the desert allowed. "This is camp," Gideon said, easing Buck to a stop. She didn't comment, didn't frown or ask for more. That told him a lot. He helped her down and steadied her when her knees threatened to give. "Easy," he said, but she'd already leaned into his side again, more out of necessity than choice. He guided her to the canvas and helped her settle against the cooler edge of one boulder. She sighed, not from comfort, but the kind of sigh that sounded like surrender. He dug into his saddlebag and found the last of his dry crackers. They crumbled in his hand as he passed them to her. She ate slow, chewing like each bite had to be considered. After a long pause, her voice came out rough but steadier. "You a rancher used to be," he said, sitting nearby without crowding her. "Up near Prescott, had land, cattle. Snow came early last winter and stayed too long. Lost most of my herd." She didn't interrupt. "Couldn't afford to hold the land after that. Sold off what I could. Now I drift fence posts, hauling freight branding work when it comes." She looked at him fully, then her eyes clear enough now to focus. "And yet you gave me what little you had. Seemed the right thing to do. You didn't know me." He met her gaze without flinching. "That's never mattered much to me." She blinked, and this time her eyes glistened. She turned her face away, and he didn't press. That night he built a fire from the few dry twigs he'd gathered earlier that week. It barely sparked, but the glow was enough to paint their faces in gold. She sat cross-legged, arms wrapped around her knees, close to the flames. When the stars emerged, dotting the blackness above like spilled salt, she spoke again. Her voice was low, almost afraid of the night hearing. "My brother's name was Kalb," she said. "I think he's gone." He didn't ask how she knew. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded, once eyes on the fire. "I came west with him after my husband passed. We were heading for a new start. Cal believed Arizona held promise. He believed it hard enough for the both of us." "What happened to your husband?" he asked gently. "Fever. Back in Kansas. Took him before we ever had a child." Her lips tightened and her hands clenched her skirts. "I've had to start over too many times." He understood that. Not the same losses, but the same ache. The weight of beginnings with no end in sight. "You don't need to start over tonight," he said. "Just rest." She turned to look at him, something soft threading through her expression. "You're kind." "I try." Then she smiled, small, unexpected, and real. And it hit him like a hammer to the ribs. A shared ride. Warmth in the silence. Gideon took the first watch. He sat with his rifle across his lap and his back against the boulder, while Seleni slept curled beneath the canvas, her breath slow and even. The night was still the kind of still that only comes when the land is too tired to stir. He didn't sleep much these days anyway, not deeply. Dreams came jagged, and most of them weren't worth having. By morning she looked better. Not strong, but less fragile, like the thread holding her had been knotted overnight. Her eyes held more focus. When he handed her a piece of jerky and his last apple, she accepted it without hesitation. They packed the camp without much talking. She folded the top before he asked. He liked that. "Where will you go?" he asked as they saddled Buck. "I don't know," she answered, brushing hair from her cheek. "There's no one left waiting for me." He hesitated, then said, "There's work in Tucson. I was headed that way. You could come, just until you find your footing." She studied him, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "You sure I wouldn't offer if I wasn't?" She nodded once. "All right." They rode together for 3 days. At first she barely spoke, conserving her voice and energy. But by the second night beneath the stars, she asked about his travels, and he told her what he could about ranches that failed, rivers that ran dry, and the names of horses he'd trusted more than men. Her laughter came quiet at first, like it had forgotten how to echo, but it was real. On the 4th morning, she handed him a tin cup of coffee brewed over fire. "I feel like I can breathe again," she said. He looked at her, and something inside him settled. "I like hearing your voice," he replied. She glanced down, his cheeks flushed. "I like talking to you." He smiled the first one in longer than he could recall. "Then keep doing it. A touch on the trail. The beginning of something new." That afternoon the landscape opened into a shallow valley. Dry grasses bent beneath a lazy breeze and dust curled up behind Buck's hooves like smoke from an old fire. Seleni rode beside him now, not just as passenger, but partner. Her spine was straighter, her grip more sure. They didn't speak much, didn't have to. Then, as they crossed an open stretch, she reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you," she said, fingers light on his sleeve. "For seeing me, for stopping. I might not have made it if you hadn't." He looked down at her hand, still resting on his coat. "I didn't stop just because you needed help." She looked up, eyes wide, with a question she didn't ask. He held her gaze. "I stopped because something in me needed to." Seleni blinked fast and leaned into his side just a little, not enough to fall, just enough to feel the nearness. They didn't speak the rest of the ride. They didn't need to. The silence between them held something now, not absence, but presence. Not emptiness, but beginning. The town of Tucson. A hand reached a life. Considered by the time the dusty road gave way to scattered signs of Tucson, the sun had lowered behind a smear of clouds, softening the heat. The first lights of the town flickered ahead, lamplight in windows, lanterns swinging gently on porches. It wasn't a large place, but it moved like it had hope, like it wanted to be something more. Seleni shaded her face with her hand, less now. Her posture had changed. She rode as someone arriving, not escaping. They passed a small grove of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering above the wind. Gideon reined in slightly and turned to her. "You sure this is the road you want?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Seleni didn't answer right away. She looked at the town ahead, then at him, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere you're not," she said. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently, the gesture speaking more than any words could. And together they rode the rest of the way in silence, the rhythm of Buck's hooves matching the stillness in their chests. The warmth between them was no longer a flicker, it was a steady flame, and it no longer needed tending. It just was, a life taking root, side by side in the quiet. The second week in Tucson brought change neither of them had quite expected. The town, dusty and low-built, had come alive with the talk of railroads. Timber storefronts rose quickly like teeth in the earth. Wagons clattered with freight men yelled over land stakes, and paper wrights and workers camped at the edge of town, waiting for the call to start laying track. Gideon found work without much looking. A sawyer on the north end needed haulers. By the third day, he was carrying timber from the mill yard to the depot site, long days that left his shoulders aching, but gave him something he hadn't had in a while, purpose that paid. Seleni, for her part, moved like she had lived here all her life. She found work at a millinery shop run by a widow named Mrs. Dobbins, stitching trim, balancing ledgers and listening with grace to the daily politics of town women. Each evening she came home with pricked fingers and a story, who had argued with whom, who was expecting, who had wandered into the saloon one too many times. They rented a small room above the saddler's shop. It wasn't much, a narrow bed, a wash basin, a wooden peg for Gideon's hat, but it was theirs. She folded her dresses into the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. He placed his gloves on the same shelf she cleared each night. Their days spun into rhythm without friction. She waited to eat until he came home. He always hung his coat just so. They shared the same blanket, the same sigh at night, the same quiet hope in the spaces between. And one evening, after a long day of hauling and dust in his teeth, Gideon walked in to find Seleni pouring water into the basin. Her brow was pinched. "You're wearing yourself thin," she said, dipping the cloth. He pulled off his boots, slow. "I'm not the only one working." "I sit and sew," she said. "You haul half the mountain. I haul it," he said, "because I want to keep you in cotton and stew." She pressed the wet cloth to his neck. "You don't need to prove anything to me. I'm not trying to." She paused, eyes locked with his. "Then why do you keep pushing so hard?" He looked at the water, then back at her. "Because I've never had something steady that didn't slip away. I don't want to lose this before it's even settled." Her hand slowed at his jaw and her fingers found his wrist. "You haven't," she whispered. "You sure I wouldn't be here if I wasn't?" Bread and questions. A midday visit. The next day, while the sun scorched the rail yard, Gideon lifted a yoke of timber onto his shoulders, sweat stinging his eyes. Voices shouted nearby, metal clanged, and dust clung to every inch of his clothes. Then he saw her. Seleni standing beneath the half-framed skeleton of the freight station, a cloth-wrapped parcel in her hands. Her hat sat slightly crooked, and a strand of hair had escaped to catch the sunlight. She smiled when he approached. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said, surprised. "I wanted to see where you go all day." He took the parcel and unwrapped it, bread and cold beans. He blinked. "I didn't know you could cook beans like this." "I asked Mrs. Dobbins," she said. "She said her late husband liked them with sage and vinegar." Gideon took a bite and nodded mouth full. He had good taste. Seleni leaned against a rail post and watched the men work, eyes thoughtful. "This town's growing faster than weeds in spring," she said. "Means more work. For a while, anyway." She tilted her head toward the distant hills. "What happens when the rails move on?" He followed her gaze. "We go with them. Maybe. Or find something else." She looked at him, her voice soft. "I don't need much. Just you, and a roof that doesn't leak." He reached for her hand, calloused and warm. "I can give you that." "I know," she said. That night, back in their little room, she unpinned her hair and sat at the edge of the bed. He unbuckled his belt and joined her, his weight creaking the boards. She didn't look up as she spoke. "Mrs. Dobbins asked me today if we were married." He stilled. "What did you say?" "I said no." A pause. "She asked if we were planning to be." He waited. "I told her I wasn't sure yet, but that I was thinking on it." His breath drew slow. "And what did she say to that?" She said, "The best men don't ask twice. But they wait once." He took her hand. "I haven't asked yet." "I know," she said, lacing her fingers with his. "But I think I'd like to keep thinking." They lay down, then her back to his chest, his arm around her waist, and the window open to the cool night wind. They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. A letter from Kansas. Grief quietly met. A week passed in gentle repetition, work meals, shared silences. Then one evening, just as Gideon was shaving by the basin, a knock came at the door. A boy no older than 10 stood on the landing, cheeks red from the cold, and a letter trembling in his hand. "Message from the freight office," he said, breathless. Gideon thanked him, handed him a coin, and closed the door behind him. Seleni took the envelope, her fingers hesitating at the seal. The postmark read, Kansas. She sat at the small table in the corner where morning light usually fell and opened the letter. As her eyes scanned the lines, her hands began to tremble. Gideon turned, blade still in hand, and watched her in the mirror. "Bad news?" he asked gently. She folded the letter slowly, her voice just above a whisper. A neighbor wrote. They found Kalb's horse outside a dry cave. No sign of him, just the saddle and a bedroll. They buried what they could. Gideon set the razor down and crossed the room. "Do you want to go back?" She shook her head firmly. "There's nothing there now." He was the last. He stood behind her, hands resting gently on her shoulders. She reached up and covered them with her own. "I'm all right," she said. "I already knew." Still he didn't move, didn't let go. "I'm not alone," she added after a beat. "Not anymore." He bent and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, slow, steady, sure. They didn't speak again that night, but something inside both of them tightened, quiet and strong, like a knot that would not come undone. And they no longer spoke of marriage. They didn't need to. A blue dress and a mourning vow. The wedding came quietly. It was a Tuesday, just after dawn, the air still cool and the town not yet stirring. Gideon wore the same shirt he'd worn the day he found her by the arroyo, washed and pressed. Seleni stood beside him in a soft blue dress she had sewn in the back room of Mrs. Dobbin's shop. She had stitched a line of white lace along the collar and hem her fingers, steady with purpose. They stood beneath the awning behind the saddler's shop, where the mission preacher agreed to meet them before his rounds out to the reservation. No music, no flowers, no guests except Mrs. Dobbins, who wept quietly into her gloves and pressed a silver hairpin into Seleni's palm for luck. Gideon slid a plain brass ring onto her finger, his hands steady his eyes, never leaving hers. The preacher's words were brief, but in the hush between each phrase, time seemed to pause, just long enough for breath and meaning to settle in their bones. Seleni didn't look away, not even when the sun crested the roof and lit up the side of his face like gold. Afterward, they returned to their small room. No fanfare, no crowd, just bread and coffee on the table, and the wind pressing gently against the shutters. She folded her napkin with careful fingers. "I used to think I'd never feel safe again," she said. He reached across the table and brushed her knuckles with the back of his hand. "You are now." She nodded once. "I know." And this time her voice didn't waver. A bare patch of land, seeing what could be. That evening they walked beyond the southern edge of town where the railroad foreman had offered Gideon a chance to oversee a small crew. The pay would be steady, and they could pitch a tent nearby until they had enough to build. The land was nothing more than a rough patch of scrub and dry grass. No fence, no shade, no water in sight. But Seleni stepped onto it like it mattered her shoes picking up dust. She studied it, not with doubt, but with imagination. "It's bare," she said. Then softer, "But I can see it. See where the door will be. Where we'll sit when it gets too hot inside." She pointed to a sloping spot under a mesquite tree where the shade had started to pull like spilled ink. "That'll be the porch then," Gideon said. She nodded. "It suits us." And just like that, they began again. They spent the next week gathering what they could canvas, from a trader headed north nails, from the depot scrap pile boards, from a man selling cheap after losing his permit to build. Seleni bartered with the potter's wife for a second-hand kettle. Gideon came home one evening with a dented tin lantern and a grin that reached the corners of his eyes. They worked late into each day, Seleni knotting twine for a clothesline while Gideon hammered in beams. He taught her how to hold the plumb line steady. She stitched the tear in his coat. They didn't speak much while they worked, but their movements, quiet, practiced, coordinated, fit together, like the join of timber, firm, silent, lasting. A storm in the frame. Fear turned to peace. One night, as the shelter stood half-framed and roofed with stretched canvas, the eastern sky rolled in thick and dark. The wind picked up in sudden snapping gusts, and the first drops came sharp as pebbles. Gideon barely had time to lash the corners of the canvas tighter before the storm let loose. They sat on the packed earth beneath the temporary roof, rain drumming overhead, the sound a steady roar broken only by wind and distant thunder. The corners of the shelter creaked, but it held. Seleni hugged her knees, her boots-off toes curled into the warmth of the earth. Her hair was damp at the edges, and her eyes shone in the dim lantern light. "I used to fear storms," she said, her voice quiet, but not trembling. Gideon sat beside her, his back against the support beam, boots stretched out in front of him, hands idle for once. "Why?" he asked. She stared ahead at the rain trickling down the canvas seams. because they meant something was coming, something you couldn't stop. He let the silence settle for a moment before answering, and now she tilted her head slightly toward him. Now it feels like something's being washed clean. The rain softened, falling in a gentler rhythm, and he reached for her hand. Her fingers were cool and still, but she let him hold them without hesitation. No more words were needed. Outside, the desert soaked in the water like a gift. Inside, under a roof barely strong enough to withstand the night, something sturdier was being built, a peace not given by safety, but by presence, by knowing they were no longer weathering storms alone. What comes next? A morning walk and a quiet wish. The next morning, steam rose from the ground as the sun climbed over the hills, warming the wet sage and damp earth. The storm had passed, leaving everything brighter. Seleni stepped outside, barefoot, her feet damp with dew, hair loose down her back, her body still but her spirit clearly awake. Gideon stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with quiet reverence. She moved with the same ease as someone who had always belonged to this land. When she turned back toward him, he spoke. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She walked to him slowly, the hem of her dress brushing the dirt. "I want a garden," she said. "Some hens, a line to dry clothes, maybe a dog." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "I can build that." She stepped closer, her fingers smoothing the edge of his collar, brushing away some dried fleck of dirt. "And you?" she asked. "What do you want?" He looked past her to the open stretch of land they were slowly claiming, then back to her. "I want to wake up with you beside me. I want to come home and know you'll be there." Her eyes didn't flinch. "You already do." He kissed her, then not quick, not rushed. Long enough for the world to still, for the rising wind to hush, for the memory of every other kiss in their lives to fade beneath this one. There was no hesitation in either of them now. That evening, they ate supper outside on a blanket, beans warmed over a fresh fire, and a half loaf of bread. She leaned into his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. "I never asked," she said, voice almost playful. "Why did you stop that day by the arroyo?" He was quiet a long time before answering. "I saw you." That was enough. She nodded and rested her head against him. The sky slipped from gold to indigo, and crickets began their night song. And in that hush they sat together in the life they were building, shelter not of canvas or nails, but of choice, of hands held out and held fast, of a love that had taken root and now finally was beginning to bloom. The house that waited, muslin curtains and lavender water. By early autumn their house stood with solid walls and a roof that no longer needed canvas. The porch offered a shaded view of the land beyond a place where Seleni liked to sit with her sewing basket and a cup of watered coffee. The windows still lacked glass, but she had stitched muslin into neat curtains that danced when the wind stirred. Gideon shaped a door latch from scrap iron and hung it with quiet pride. The house smelled of cut wood, sun-warmed earth, and the faint lavender Seleni stirred into their wash-water. In the quiet before dusk, it already felt like a home that had always been waiting for them to find it. Gideon spent most days at the rail yard now. His crew had grown, and he was trusted to oversee freight checks before the cargo headed east. Each day, he came home with dirt under his nails, and the kind of tired that meant something had been earned. Seleni, meanwhile, took in mending work from neighbors. Mrs. Dobbins had quietly spread the word that she could patch a collar better than most tailors. Her sewing was clean and strong, her hems set to last through 3 seasons. She kept their coin carefully in a tin box beneath the bed and wrote their expenses on a small ledger she never misplaced. One evening, while Gideon washed the day's sweat and soil from his hands at the basin, she pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "A woman at the depot gave this to me," she said. "She's looking for help at the school. Her assistant married and moved north." He dried his hands slowly. "You thinking of taking it?" I told her. "I taught my cousin's children back in Kansas." He nodded. "You'd be good at it. I said I could come next Monday, just to sit in. You want me to ride with you?" She paused, then smiled faintly. "I think I'd like to go on my own." And he nodded once, knowing what that meant. On Monday, she walked the half-mile to the schoolhouse in her blue wedding dress, a braid falling down her back. Gideon stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching. She didn't look back, but the swing of her shoulder said she knew he was there. A story read aloud, belonging in the classroom. When Seleni returned just past noon, the sun was high and Gideon was stacking kindling near the shed. She stepped lightly up beside him and leaned her shoulder against his arm. He paused, glancing down. "Well," he asked. "I read to them," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He waited. A story about a boy raised by wolves. They listened, even the ones who couldn't sit still. She smiled, then small and true. "One girl asked if I'd be back tomorrow." "You will," I told her yes. She didn't need to say more. He could see it in the way her shoulders eased in the soft crease of joy at the corner of her eyes. She was not just filling time, she was beginning to root. That night, they ate cornbread and boiled greens by lantern light. Gideon washed the plates while she dried their movements, practiced and quiet. As they stood at the basin, he said, "I've been thinking about building a fence." She looked at him, puzzled. "For what a pen? Maybe goats, a milk cow if we find a good one." She dried her hands slowly. "You think we're ready for that?" He met her gaze. "I think we're ready for more than just getting by." Her smile came slowly but fully, and she nodded. "Then we'll need a trough and a better bucket. I'll see what I can trade for." There was no debate, no hesitation, just a shared acknowledgement that they had begun to build not just a shelter, but a life that stretched forward. Little things, quiet hopes, signs of a future. The weeks that followed brought more than just wages. They brought small sacred things. One afternoon, Gideon returned from the rail yard with a pair of leather-bound readers for Seleni's classroom, one for practice, the other for her to read aloud. "From the overseer's boy," he said, "outgrew them." Another day she brought home a carved hair comb left in the mission's donation basket. She didn't keep it for herself. She wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into Gideon's drawer. "For our daughter," she said quietly, "if we ever have one." They didn't speak of children often, but the thought lived in the room like sunlight, soft and patient. Gideon had begun carving a cradle in the evenings, not rushing, just fitting pieces together, smoothing joints, testing the curve of the rail. Seleni didn't ask. She only folded a small blanket and placed it in the cedar chest where their other hopes rested. By early winter, the house had changed again. Real glass in the windows, a stovepipe rising clean from the roof, 2 chairs on the porch now, garlic cloves planted in tidy rows along the garden bed's edge. Inside, Gideon built her a shelf for books. She filled it slowly, first with borrowed primers, then a notebook of her own. In it, she copied her students' names and the words they learned each week. Brave morning, hold home. The days still held work and dust, but something deeper had taken root. The kind of quiet that didn't come from silence but from knowing. A letter and a choice, staying for what matters. One cold evening just after supper, a knock came at the door. Gideon answered to find a boy, maybe 13, cheeks flushed and breath misting in the dark. "Message from the freight office," he said, holding out an envelope. Gideon thanked him and passed him a coin. Inside the letter was short and stamped with the Northern Company's seal. "They're offering me a post up near Flagstaff." Gideon told Seleni, reading it again. "More pay. Permanent. Lodging for us both." Seleni folded the dishcloth in her hands. "Do you want to go?" He didn't answer right away. "Only if it's what you want too." She crossed the room and looked out the window. The yard was bare but theirs. The moon lit the porch and the faint outline of the mesquite tree. "We built this with our hands," she said. "I don't want to leave it." "Then we won't," he said without pause. She turned to him, her voice soft. "Promise me whatever changes come, we stay rooted in what we've made." He stepped forward, pressed his forehead to hers. "I swear it." Spring came like a quiet miracle. Lambs were born in a neighbor's pasture. Seleni's students brought her wildflowers tied with string. The goat they bartered for had a lopsided ear and a gentle nature. Seleni named her Clover. One golden evening, with the sun low and soft behind them, Seleni took Gideon's hand and placed it on the gentle curve of her belly. "You'll be a father by harvest," she whispered. He didn't speak, just held her close and kissed her temple. The warmth of dusk wrapped around them like a promise already kept. The life that stayed, years in quiet motion. The years did not gallop, they walked in, soft-footed and steady with the rhythm of morning fires, mended clothes, and lessons taught in a room that smelled of chalk and pine dust. The cradle Gideon built held a daughter, first then a son 2 winters later. They named them after no one, wanting the children to carry only what they built together, not what had been lost. The house weathered well. Rain carved rings into the porch rail. Wind dusted the garden beds. The wooden floor creaked differently in spring than in fall. But the roof held, and the warmth inside did too. Gideon's beard began to silver at the edges, though his arms remained strong. He still hauled lumber when needed, still walked the fence line every week, still sharpened the kitchen knives himself. Seleni's hands remained steady through every stitch, every spoon stirred, every child's forehead touched in sleep. Her hair grew longer, darker with time before giving in to threads of silver. She taught each child to read, just as she'd once taught children who weren't her own. And on quiet evenings she sat with her feet tucked beneath Gideon's knees, darning socks or reading aloud. They didn't chase more than what they had. And what they had was enough. A home not of ambition or noise, but of decisions made slowly. Meals shared. Tools hung in the same place. Words spoken carefully. Hands held without needing to ask. They never needed grand declarations. Love here was a garden, not a blaze, but a rooted, returning thing. A knock in winter, new paths, old promises. It was a night like most others, the children already asleep, the air outside sharp and quiet. Gideon had just finished rubbing down his boots when the knock came, a firm, purposeful sound that didn't belong to chance. At the door stood a rail clerk older than most, his coat dusted with frost. He handed Gideon a sealed envelope. "From Flagstaff office," he said. "They remembered you." Gideon nodded, said thanks, and closed the door softly. Seleni sat at the table with a book in her lap, though her eyes had already left the page. "Well?" she asked. "They want me for a rail extension crew," he said. "A full post, supervisor pay, housing too." She was quiet, not unreadable, just turning it over in her mind, the way she did with most things. She never spoke in reaction, only in choice. "Do you want to go?" she asked. He looked at the stove, the shelf of books, the toy ox carved by their son still sitting near the door. "I'd go," he said, "if it made sense. But we've planted ourselves here." She nodded. "We did." He stepped closer. "I don't want to tear that up for more coin." "I wouldn't let you," she said, smiling. And just like that, the decision was made, not because of fear or stubbornness, but because they had already chosen once, and that choice had held. They sat by the fire afterward, her legs tucked over his, the room wrapped in heat and time. No one needed to speak what was already known, that this life was not something they stumbled into. It was something they stayed for. Wild flowers and goat bells. The spring of more spring arrived like a kindness-warm soil, soft rain laughter drifting from the schoolyard, where Seleni still taught half-days. Their daughter, now 5, brought home wildflowers and wrinkled drawings. Their son, just beginning to walk, steadily followed Gideon through the garden rows, mimicking his every step. Clover the goat with a crooked air now shared the pen with a second, more stubborn companion, Seleni named Bramble. Gideon had finally finished the fence he once spoke of as a passing idea. Now it stood strong and square, lining the back acre like a quiet vow kept. One evening, while watering the garlic bed, Seleni stood up, hand resting on her lower back, and looked across the land. This place was just a thought, she said, a patch of dust and guesswork. Gideon stood beside her, wiping sweat from his brow. "Now it's ours," she smiled, "and it's more than enough." Seleni had lined it with muslin and tucked the small folded blanket inside the one she'd stitched before their daughter's birth. She didn't place anything else in it, no rattle, no charm, no embroidery, just the quiet space waiting. They didn't speak about trying again, didn't press against the memory of the miscarriage from the winter before. It had come suddenly and gone silently like a guest who never made it past the door, but they built anyway. Some nights Seleni would brush her hand along the cradle's rail, not weeping, not even wishing, just remembering. Gideon never interrupted her. Instead, he'd keep working at the back fence or sorting nails in the shed or cutting firewood he didn't yet need. And when she walked back into the house, he would look up. Always. That was the kindest grief they shared without naming it, without letting it grow too loud, but the cradle remained. Not as a promise, not as an ache, just as a place to hold what might come, the school bell and a new beginning. Seleni's days at the school became more than just a part-time effort, they became hers. By mid-year, the town had offered her the full post. She'd said yes with her usual calm and brought home chalk dust on her sleeves and new vocabulary words scribbled on loose papers. She taught reading numbers and the kind of patience only she knew how to give. Her students adored her. The girls braided her hair at recess. The boys ran to show her every bug and scraped knee. She never raised her voice, but when she looked at them, really looked, they listened. Gideon watched her from the porch some mornings, mug in hand, as she walked down the trail. He never offered to accompany her again. She carried herself like someone who had found her own rhythm, her own belonging. He took pride in the school's repairs, fixing a latch, oiling the door, smoothing the splintered steps. And when she stayed late preparing lessons, he had stew ready by the time she returned. He didn't say much, but she always knew it mattered to him, her voice, her students, her stillness when she worked. One evening she set her satchel down and said, "There's a girl. Emma. She writes her letters backward, but she's trying so hard." Gideon reached for the bowl of beans and nodded. "You're good with the ones who try. They're all trying," she said. And somehow that felt like something worth believing in. "This," she said softly, "is the life I didn't dare imagine." He didn't answer at first, just rested his cheek against her hair. "You don't have to imagine it anymore." She nodded. "It's strange. We never built it all at once. Just little by little. That's the only way it ever lasts." They sat in silence as dusk took over, the stars beginning to press through the sky like seeds planted in velvet. Somewhere the rooster let out a confused, half-hearted crow, and they laughed. Not loud, not wild, just full. From the belly, from the place where contentment lives. The house behind them was not grand, the land was not easy, but every board, every meal, every quiet breath taken side by side, that was their wealth. They had planted love into dust, and it had grown. The rope and the nail. A quiet day, a shared. Future one. Crisp morning. Gideon sat beneath the eaves of the barn, sorting lengths of rope, repairing what could be saved and discarding what couldn't.